Welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd and I'm a writer and academic. On this show, I talk to other writers about their work and practice. We also collaborate on a close reading of their writing, looking at a particular passage or a whole poem, and talk about its meanings, resonances, and the technicalities of language. This is a show for book nerds, aspiring and established authors, or anyone interested in how texts get made. In this episode, I talked to Lola Olufemi about the opening of her book, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. Lola is a black feminist writer and researcher from London. She is the author of Feminism Interrupted and Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. Hi Lola, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited. I mean, you know, I'm a fan of your work. Anyway, and I'm excited to talk about this book. I've got it here. This book has been very helpful to my brain. The quote, "ambivalence is not another word for freedom," is on a post-it note on my wall, just so you know.
Oh, thank you. That's a huge compliment. Yeah, I'm really excited. I haven't done anything like this with this book, so I'm really excited to close read it with you.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, the opening question I ask everyone is like, what are your thoughts on close reading? How do you feel about it as like a practice? And also, how do you feel about close reading your own work with other people?
That's, a really excellent question. I think I come from the kind of, I'm thinking I did an English literature undergrad degree, and I guess I come from that kind of like I.A. Richards school of like practical criticism, close reading. And so I have I think that I like close reading without context because I think it sharpens my analytical tools. But maybe just because that's the way I was trained, I just like have this affinity for it. And I think it makes me really slow down and think about the words on the page. It removes guesswork in a sense. It reestablishes a more kind of intimate connection with a text by a reader. And I feel like the practice of close reading provides me with a bit more autonomy, even if I'm wrong, even if the close reading is like insufficient or not correct analytically. I think I do a lot of close readings in workshops that I do with other people, especially people who are not so confident about literature or the practice. And I find that when we can unlock and investigate a text together, when we can be curious and argue and disagree, and when we're not afraid to make mistakes or be wrong in terms of what we think the text means, like when we remove that imperative to like know the text absolutely, I think that like close reading becomes this real expression of curiosity and fun and playfulness. And so the relationship is complicated. I think I like it for the tools that it's given me, but I think it also makes me sometimes like a little bit of a snob. I don't know. I'm also trying to like shed that like very highbrow training that I had about like what to do with the text, how you close read it, what close reading means. Sometimes it's just all about, you want it to just be about like feeling or the experience of like reading a text or, you know, hearing it aloud rather than all of these things you're supposed to know about it.
And are you excited to read your own work, or are you more comfortable doing it with other people's work?
I mean, obviously way more comfortable with other people's. I'm excited to bounce off of you. And I think something that I find quite interesting and something that's happened quite a lot with this book, especially with younger people who read it, is that they'll come up to me and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I love this and it meant this and I thought it meant this." And I was like, I'm kind of like, no, it doesn't. But I really like that you're so confident in your reading of it. And so I think there's something about close reading your own text as an author that takes away the mystery of how you created it for the reader. But I'm interested to get into it and hopefully I'm going to let you lead and then we'll see where we go from there. Because I think as a writer, I know that all of my work finds itself in the editing process. So when I'm writing that like initial draft or initial paragraph, I'm never thinking, there is a way that like obviously my own style is inherent, but I'm never thinking about like device or technique. That all comes in after. I'm just like maybe thinking about a feeling or an idea I'm trying to flesh out, and then I go back and give it a structure. So in that way, I often can't say like, yes, I was very deliberate in the moment of writing it about this phraseology or this like blah blah blah. It all comes after.
That's exciting. I mean, we'll talk more about your writing practice later because that's really nice to pick up on. So we're going to look at a very early passage in Experiments in Living Otherwise. Did you want to say anything about the book generally before we hear the passage, or should we just jump straight in? How do you feel?
So this is an excerpt from the beginning of the book. This is like the very first two paragraphs of the book. And I guess in this beginning part, which I very ironically wrote last, I wanted to give this book a poetic framing, and I wanted to kind of flesh out the ideas and concepts in it and talk about how it was related to this method of feeling. So how I was trying to use language and the texture of language to evoke feelings in readers that were connected to the impetus to resist, or connected to a structure of feeling, or a desire for the world to be organized in a different way. So I didn't want the book to just be kind of free floating experiments. I wanted there to be a semi-clear framework that helped position me politically, helped position my attempts at writing inside of this like broader political frame.
Amazing. Great. Well, if you're okay to read the passage for us, that'd be fantastic.
I hold, like those before me, that experiments can and do fail. I am trying to make an argument for the otherwise. Not otherwise as in over here, come find me, or a small black dot that recedes as I approach. Not that thing that is obscured and needs to be unobscured. Not a smudge or an absence or an entity to be owned or conquered. The future is no one's property. No need to shackle it. Not otherwise as in the political horizon awaits. Otherwise as in a firm embrace of the unknowable. The unknowable as in a well of infinity I want us to fall down together. Otherwise, the future is now, and all those political promises we make to one another, all the wishing and hoping in earnest. Say it 3 times like a spell: wishing and hoping, wishing and hoping, wishing and hoping. All the leaps from the edges of bridges and mountaintops, all the reaching for and around, all the drug taking and sex everywhere we should not, all the serious study and strategy, theorizing and making anew, all the breakages that slice historical space time, all those movements that clear space and mark our struggle to live free, live better, love more, to knit abundance. All that is the work of another realm that is not here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm really fascinated in the styles and modes of writing in this book, right? To call it just nonfiction seems limiting to me somehow, right? It's doing so many things as poetry. There's all kinds of stuff in here. And I think in these opening paragraphs, you give us a real sense of like voice, whether it's your voice, whether it's the speaker's voice, like however we distinguish those kinds of things. And yeah, I really want to kind of get into some of those like specific things that I think you're doing, or at least that I feel like you're doing. And that first sentence, I hold, like those before me, that experiments can and do fail. There's like loads in here. I say this with everyone about almost like sentence structure, right? I feel like I would probably write like those before me, comma, I hold the experiments. Instead, you do I hold, comma, like those before. Like this little pause, right? Where you begin with the you doing, right? Like I hold. Then there's this other thought about like other people have done, that experiments kind of do fail. And as you're saying, like when you're writing instinctively for feeling, right? Not for kind of sentence structure. But at what level do you think are you thinking about that in the edit stage? Where those pauses come, how those pauses happen?
I think instinctively, I'm also thinking about what a text sounds like when read aloud. So I think for me, the sentence structure of that first sentence was about injecting a kind of like colloquial sensibility to the sentence. I wanted it to feel like I was actually talking to someone rather than following the rules of like the grammatical rules of like where a clause should be, right? And I think that evolved, like when you're trying to write as if you speak, then you take far more like pauses. There is a sense that you want to like emphasize specific, clauses or ideas. But I think with that first sentence, I really wanted to start with failure. I wanted to start with like trying to position myself as like the voice or the narrative voice of this text in a long legacy of like failed attempts at experimenting. When I was writing the book, wanted there to be a kind of playful tongue-in-cheek element where I was kind of like winking at the audience and being like, I know that this, might be a frame that loses its sparkle in like 2 or 3 years. Like experimentation, like collaboration, forms of critical fabulation, poetics, the imagination. They're all ideas that over time kind of sag and can become limp because of how in the repeated use of them there is a kind of hollowing out of like what it means. And so I wanted that sense of like, oh, other people have tried this and I'm doing my own version and maybe I'm doing it rubbish and maybe I'm doing it good. Like I wanted that to also be present there. That's some of the ideas around the sentence. But yeah, I connect to what you're saying about the sentence structure. And I've never personally been good at knowing, as a former literature student, grammar was not the thing that I was good at. So
No, no, but I think it almost doesn't matter, right? It's more like how the grammar works on a person, right? And it's the kind of invert, like maybe not what you're expecting or what I would do, but I kind of like that back, that we would both do different things, and that I hold comma, and like hold has so much kind of resonance anyway, like holding, but like the holding open, the holding of an idea, the holding is care,
yes.
right?
Also holding together, yeah, holding together, which is
Yeah,
really crucial, I think, in this sentence. And there's an intimacy there that I'm trying to build. I think this whole text is about trying to build a connection with the reader and saying, I want you to think through this set of ideas with me, and within that thinking together, there's space to disagree, there's space to contradict each other, there's space for us both to hold contradiction together, and how do we
yeah.
do that?
Would you say like another one of my favorite quotes from this is like, there is as much space in I know as I don't know, or some kind of phrase like that, right? Which,
Yeah.
the idea of holding open, which I think is something that people get scared of, right, in terms of ideas or politics, or the idea that within kind of abolition thinking as well, it's like we could think otherwise, and people are like, yeah, but I want an answer now. Like, what would that mean? What would that look like? Tell me what it would be. And it's like, no, how about just thinking about holding open as a first step?
Yeah, I think I'm always drawn to thinkers and writers, feminist thinkers in particular, that have a specific generosity in the way that they're thinking and also aren't afraid to be wrong. I hope that that's also a thread that runs through the book. And I guess with that particular phrase, like there is as much space in I know as I don't know. I think I was trying to exercise this annoyance that I had about always being told that my reading practices or my analytical practices when I was doing English literature were too didactic. That was a word that came up often. It's like you're too sure about how the world should be. You're too invested in this idea that there needs to be a revolution in how we live, that we need to transform material conditions. And I think that when you have an experience of like an elite education, as I did, you're constantly being there's a constant attempt to like inculcate you into this like highbrow ambivalence. They don't want you to care about the world as it's produced through language, through actions, through the flow of capital, right? Like there is a kind of aestheticizing of those processes, so you're supposed to hold the violence of those processes, historical or otherwise, at arm's length, and you're supposed to only hint at them in the writing. I never found that appealing. Not only did I find it cowardly, I found it to be a dereliction of like ethical responsibility to other people. I found it to be profoundly like it angered me a lot. And so like that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to say that the argument is often that there's no nuance in surety. And it's like there absolutely is. There's always space, like you said, to be open, to hold contradiction, to be generous, to change one's mind, but to be sure about a certain set of principles in the world. Writers shouldn't be scared of that. And that means that there are writers with sets of principles that I will vehemently disagree with. That's also fine. But that kind of subtle stripping and the kind of implanting of ambivalence as somehow like more beautiful, more fruitful, more expansive is rubbish to me.
And I think you do a lot of that kind of intellectual clearing in this first paragraph. I'm trying to make an argument. I love that as well. It's not like I'm making an argument, like I'm trying to make an argument. Really, the emphasis is on attempt, right? Rather than And that's like, not to be pretentious, right? The early kind of French translation of essay, right? Like essayer is like to try out. It's like it's always an attempt. The original idea of an essay was never conclusive, but rather, let me think something through. And what you don't then do is say, this is what I mean by the otherwise. You have not, no one's, not, right? You give us all the definitions of what it isn't. And I think that's a really interesting kind of position to begin with. Not otherwise, as in over here. I want to talk about those little chevrony things in a minute. Come find me, or this. Not that thing. The future is no one's property. Not otherwise, as in. And I really think, to me, that does something to the kind of experience of reading the text, that we want really definitively a definition of this. The main concept that the author is giving us, right? Like, this is what we're going to talk about today, the otherwise. And you're like, wait, let me tell you what it isn't, though, first, right? Because as soon as I tell you what it is, you're going to come up with your rebuttals, maybe, right? Is how it feels. It almost feels like you're staging other people's querying already.
Yeah, it's an attempt to preempt. I think you come from that school of like
Yes.
having a critique of capitalism or having a feminist framework. You're always or even being in the academy, you're always preempting a counter argument. And in this sense, I was preempting the counter argument that feeling in materialist politics doesn't matter or shouldn't be given like primacy or isn't as important as a dry economism or like a critique of the political economy or whatever. And if I rewrote it now, I wouldn't do that, because in a way it felt like it does still feel like a little, like a very gendered preempting. And it doesn't, and I realize now it's like I don't care about those people who make those arguments. So I didn't have to cede to them so much. But I really pick up on what you're saying about, I think the negation, like starting from the place of what it isn't, is the method that I'm trying to use to figure out what it is. Because nobody, like I said, the future doesn't belong to anyone. So as a narrative voice, I can't make claims about what it is. I can only collaboratively get us to think about all the things that it isn't, as a way of like arriving at a collective social vision, or as a way of arriving at some sense of like what the horizon might feel like, what it might feel like effectively, for example. And I really liked what you said about the essay, because I'm returning to that school of thinking about the essay as a weighing up of ideas, as a way to like gander, and as a way, I think the best essayists really do that. They like circle round the idea and you're not actually quite sure where they land sometimes. And the process of like reading in that way is really edifying in terms of your ability to hold contradiction, which is like a basic Marxist principle. And yeah, your ability to engage with any kind of like dialectic. So that's what I was maybe, yeah, trying to do in not presenting, ironically, like a surefire definition of like, this is what the otherwise is. I didn't want to like produce another linguistic enclosure. I wanted it, and then maybe that's like also why I'm using these, like, I don't know what they're called, like brackets or like whatever, because I wanted to try and break the words apart. I wanted there to still be some sense that like anything at any moment could change in the text, even though you were reading it in a book that had been printed, revised, etc.
Yeah, I want to come to the word otherwise in a minute when we get to that second paragraph about how you landed on that word. But yeah, in that second line, like not otherwise as in, and then you have these like 6 little like triangle brackets that are kind of like directional, right? Like as in over here, exclamation mark, like 4 of those. It feels immediately like you're telling us something as readers of like, as you said earlier, I'm not conforming to a particular mode of writing or a particular kind of stylistic mode. Like it feels like text almost, when you kind of use different kinds of like punctuation in like messaging between friends, right? It feels informal, quote unquote, whatever that is, but also it's like playful. It's like so many things. I think you're telling the reader that while you're doing very high thinking in a way, right? Like you're talking about experimentation, you're talking about thought, and then already you're kind of playing at the level of the line. And that to me automatically makes me go like, this isn't what I'm expecting to read. And I kind of love that as a style and as a aesthetic choice.
Mm. I think there's also like something about multiple exclamation marks, just like visually, that's a bit naive. Like it feels very like it feels quite childlike. Or there's a switch between like that little those two words like over here might be as you're reading it, they might be said in a different voice. Like the punctuation indicates that like they're separated from the rest of the sentence because they're expressed in a different tone. And I think I wanted to there are so many elements of the imagination as a process of bringing that which does not previously exist into being that are yes subjective but also childlike. They require a belief system that children have that adults often lose. And so yeah, I wanted to also put the hints of that of like returning to like constituting that of the otherwise or using our imaginations in this capacious manner might require us to like access some childlike qualities in our belief that things could be different, that the world needn't be organized around misery or pain or violence.
Yeah. And the different kinds of, I don't know, registers that you're using throughout the text, right? The voice doesn't sit in one singular mode, which I kind of really appreciate. Like it doesn't standardize itself in a way that we might expect from other kind of traditional quote unquote essays, right? And I think that's part of this play, this type of experimentation. The line, the future is no one's property, no need to shackle it, which I don't know if I thought about it in the first time I read it, but the words property and shackle to me immediately conjure up, I don't know, discourses of slavery, right? Like they feel like words linked to enslavement. And I wonder, I don't know, you don't have to say yes or no to this, but the idea of the future being something that, is within that capitalist empire colonial worldview, right? That these other lines have been much broader, right, in terms of thinking. But here, like property and shackle, I'm like, ooh, we are now grounded in that materialist world that you're
Yeah.
thinking through. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I was thinking about how worlds that are defined by the flow of capital or like just capitalism as a social, political, moral, ethical system often place parameters on what the future is. They narrow the horizon constantly. The future is AI, the future is your labor being replaced by XYZ. And I wanted to use the word private property because it's like one of the core and central values in Marxist thought that must be abolished in order for communism and other modes of like free being to actually be established. Like thinking about Marx and Engels saying that communism is a movement to abolish the present state of things, and what defines the present state of things: ownership and private property. And so I wanted to say, in our conceptualizations of the future, there also needs to be a radical embrace of contingency, which is not at odds with a materialist social vision. Like to embrace the unknowable, to embrace what like the kind of vectors of like what is not known, what is not predictable, what cannot be foreseen, doesn't necessarily contradict with the party program or like attempts at establishing political vision or political grounds through collective organization, because I often found that those two things were positioned as at odds with each other. So when I'm saying no need to shackle it, is that this invented future that we're talking about needn't also then conform to the conventions of what capitalism dictates in our collective imaginaries that the future look like. It doesn't have to bend. It can be, for want of a better word, completely free, completely unrestrained.
Yeah. Then the end of that paragraph, when you then say otherwise as in, which again is not like fully otherwise is, right? Otherwise as in, that in makes you go like, okay, maybe not fully then. A firm embrace, the unknowable as in a well of infinity. I want us to fall down together, which again is like a move within the book of like this is a me and you reader endeavor, right? Like this is a collective approach. This is not the singular I voice of the book claiming things, but rather like we have to do this collectively, and that could be a kind of Marxist collectivity. But it to me at the level of language, or the reader isn't let off the hook, kind of right. The reader has to do something in this process.
Yeah, I do also think the movement from I to us is extremely deliberate in that sense. It's like the embrace of the unknowable must be collective in order for it to be workable. And so, yeah, I agree with that reading of like, and there are many ways that I do this in the book in terms of leaving space for the reader to write back, asking questions that don't necessarily have answers. But I didn't want to imbue the narrative voice with any authority, which is why everything is extra qualified in some sense, which like it maybe is good, maybe is annoying in another way. But yeah, that extra qualification is because I want to signal towards the relationality involved in thinking together and the necessary interdependence that it requires for us to answer the question like what is to be done, like very broadly. And I think that that's where language for me becomes a tool to create specific effective environments, like the repeated use of not, the kind of longed out sentences. I'm trying to, I guess, like establish a feeling in the reader where they're like lulled not into a place of security but into a place of like curiosity and thinking and wishing and dreaming, so that like there's something that flows textually between me and them which constitutes a desire. Like I'm thinking about desire in the way that Balant defines it as like this cloud of possibility, thinking about like the subject and object relationship, you know, and I'm trying to shape the character of that desire using language.
Yeah. As I was reading the book, I was like, I feel like Lola has read some Lauren Balant. You can feel their presence in the background, but also someone like Sarah Ahmed, right? Like the way that both of those writers think on the page, think through language.
Yeah, and they're playful as well.
Yes, exactly. Both of them are like they're clearly having fun even while they're saying deadly serious things. And I always appreciate that in their work. And yeah, I was like, I wonder how much they're hanging behind this. And then you get paragraph 2, otherwise colon, and it's something, you know, you're expecting like a dictionary definition or something, right? You know, that you'd have there, otherwise brackets, and instead you get in the copy, in the physical copy, like a 12-line run-on sentence, right? Just joined together with commas, as you say, which becomes super expansive, but also kind of breathless, right? In the way that these ideas are tumbling over each other that actually otherwise can't be defined. And while we can talk through some of the words that come up, I did want to ask, did you land on otherwise, like really early in the process? Was otherwise the word that helped you? Because, you know, there are lots of other ones that people have used, right, for this thinking, this kind of different imaginary or...
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think so. I think it was a word that just kept repeating because it was initially a filler for that orientation or pointing in the direction of the future. And a lot of these same words like come up in a lot of the thinking that I was doing, a lot of the writing that I was doing, like futurity, temporality, its relationship to radical cultural production. And so in a way, like otherwise to me feels like an empty word and one like prime to be filled. And so yeah, I guess it just at the very beginning of the book I say that the otherwise is kind of like it's a gesture. It's not itself in and of itself like fully contained. And that's really important for keeping the ability to like clarify and qualify and think together, but it's also really important in rejecting, which this book tries to do, totality even formally, right? Like it's trying to like write in fragments, thinking in bits. It's not presenting a firm and solid idea. And so yeah, I think when I was writing I was going back to a lot of the things that I was like forced to read when I was an undergrad. And I remember there was this essay that Adorno wrote about the essay as form or something, I think it might be called that. And in it he says something about like, you know, that the essay doesn't conform to the principles of like good science, like it refuses to behave and to act as if, you know, philosophical ideas or ideas that aren't total aren't worthy of investigation. And like that's what I wanted to kind of get across. I wanted to be like, yeah, actually I can, all these things that feel fragmentary, ephemeral, can be given a temporary solidity in my attempt to like think them through and connect them in this way and like galvanize. I think I'm very, again, maybe the feelings of the reaction against being called didactic finds its way into the style, because the material actualization of a lot of my work, the process of writing, is always about like, I do want the reader to come away with something, like whether it's a pure hatred or like a real love of the text. Like I do want to do something. I want there to be a change in state.
Yeah. I mean, if it makes you feel any better, my my PhD supervisor constantly told me I was being too argumentative. Then when I had my Viva, both examiners were like, this is really argumentative. And then when I submitted it as a book and it got published, the peer reviewer was like, this is really argumentative. And I was like, yeah, because I feel really strongly about these things. Why are you not understanding that?
Yeah, exactly. I think that aversion in literary studies needs to be like, I'm sure people have done this, like critically thought about, because I guess I made my exit from, I think of myself as an interdisciplinary like thinker and writer, but I really made my exit from literary studies because I couldn't stand the ambivalence. Like I could not stand it. So I had to actually go in search of like gender studies, sociology, whatever, like some kind of other frame. And now I find myself kind of in cultural studies, and actually the literary, I miss it. Like it does give me a way, which is partly why I wrote this book as well, because I wanted to actually do justice to the fact that yes, I feel like I am a writer, and I do that's the way that I naturally express myself.
Yeah, for sure. And but also that language is inherently like generative and playful, right? Like the bit where you say all the wishing and hoping earnest, brackets, say it 3 times like a spell, wishing and hoping, wishing, like it's like funny, right? Like it's fun, and I don't know. That language is the route to, or is one route to like making things possible, right? Like as you said earlier, like language shapes the world in which we live. And I think maybe that's, I don't know, I feel like people forget that, right? That we understand each other through often like the linguistic frames that allow us to think certain things. And by you messing with language at the level, like on the page, helps some of that happen, right? That it doesn't just become the future is now and all those political promises. Like, you know, you can feel a reader being like, okay, this is gonna be serious. And then you're like, let me give you a little bracketed bit that's fun. And then you get all the leaps from the edges and bridges and mountaintops all reaching for and around. Just really rich sentence, like all that sibilance that runs through it, all the serious study and strategy theorizing, like so much sibilance in this little bit. Like it sounds like rich and moving. Like the sentences move.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to capture like that Stuart Hall thing of like Marxism without guarantees, and like the promise in the sense of like Cedric Robinson's idea of like promise, like this idea that like we can't know, nothing is will be just handed to us. Nothing, the future won't just appear. And so like it is made up. What all of these different clauses are trying to do is to show the many dimensions that this like political horizon or future or whatever you want to call it might be made up of. And I wanted in there to include nods to pleasure and play. And I get that from like being queer and engaging in queer theory, that the future is not just a site of the fruition of a specific set of political ideas. It's also embodied. It is also about like sex everywhere we should not. It is also about all of those practices. And I guess if we're thinking about like political promise, and I was thinking a lot about ideas of like fugitivity and all of the present day rehearsals that especially oppressed groups engage in order to glimpse the future, either aesthetically or in an embodied way. Those are still also important. And so that's what I meant by theorizing and making anew. All of those breakages that slice historical space-time, all of those practices open junctures. They help us to understand the current conjuncture that we're in a new way. All in that sense of like you said, Joic, they give us a way of understanding like texture as a repeated pattern. So like that's what I'm always thinking, why in times of crisis do I return to art and art practices, like especially language and like poetry, for example, as a means of trying to understand the moment. And I think it's because it provides a texture to my everyday life. It makes me feel differently. And like that's what those clauses, like the live free, live better, love more, I wanted to like stack those desires on top of one another so that they like build in momentum and then kind of like gesture away as the sentence ended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fully. But that rhythm like really speeds up for me, right? I think that's I was reading aloud. The sibilance runs into live free, live better, love more, to knit abundance. Like the speed is picking up as we're kind of
We're gallivanting toward
yes,
towards
yeah,
some kind of end that hopefully isn't final.
yeah. All that is the work of another realm that is not here. And like it was making me think of Jose Esteban Munoz as well, like his work and think about futurity, but just the not here, which I think is so hard to think, right? Like it's much harder to think that like the thing that's not present than the thing that is. But what you're doing, like in the language, is even if we don't yet know what that looks like, the language or how you're playing with language is helping us move at least right on the page, and I think that's quite exciting.
Yeah, that's a very generous reading. And yeah, I appreciate it. It's nice to hear. I feel like in the reading there is some sense that you kind of have locked onto what my intention was. And actually it's been a long time since I've returned to this book. So like reading it now I'm like, "Oh, yeah, maybe I was trying to do that." I don't know whether I thought about it that deeply when I was actually doing it. But it's nice to look at your own work as if there was some complexity there that's important.
Oh, there definitely is, but I mean, even if you know intention, like whatever, right? But like unconsciously or consciously, you were doing something, you were trying to work something out in the words. One of my aims in this podcast is to share that message with people that might not be in like the spaces that we're always in, or in classrooms, or in, you know what I mean. That language does have effects, and those effects are worth attending to.
Yeah, like definitely it's like it's a force. I can't remember. I was in a workshop and we were talking about somebody's writing. I can't remember who it is, but I was saying that maybe their poetics was so commanding that it's like you better get up and do something. Like you better like, you know? And I guess a lot of the intention behind that this book is trying to create that same mood regardless of whether the person does or not. Like it's like that stand up straight, like yeah. And it's sometimes it's some people do it very well and it comes from this deep place of authority that next to the reader, and I guess I'm trying to do it through an invitation to collaborate.
Yeah, which is a great maybe segue to thinking about your writing practice. You said earlier, like you do more of the work in the editing, or you know that the editing is. But do you have a general writing practice? Do you have rituals? Do you have a setup? Are you doing it on your phone, on computers, by hand?
I would say that my writing practice, when I am on a deadline or I need to do something, I can't write at home because I'll just eat and like smoke cigarettes and like scroll. I'll just distract myself. So honestly, I would say the most consistent writing practice I have is going to science floor 2 in the British Library. I'm just like sitting there. That's where I wrote my PhD. I wrote Feminism Interrupted in SOAS Library. I like to write in libraries. Something about having other people around you alerts you to a specific kind of performance of writing that you should be doing, even if you're not. So like I rarely, unless I'm like I guess doing freelance work or a different kind of writing, I'll be by myself. But I love to go to the library. It also gives me a structure of the day, and I like going to the same room and kind of like trying to sit in the same place. I get a lot done when I'm in the library. But that's the only, and I always write on a laptop. I'm kind of scared of writing by hand. I probably should, but I haven't done that thus far. Yeah, I'm mostly writing on a laptop and constantly backing things up because I'm scared that they'll like my laptop will crash or like turn off or disappear or something. Yeah, that's mainly what I'm doing. And I'm always trying to read poetry whilst I'm writing something. I'm not sure if I'm writing nonfiction. I can't read other nonfiction because I'll just start writing in the style of that person. So I don't do that. But I always have like a poetry book on hand. I often feel like when I feel stuck, just reading someone else, like reading a good essay or reading a good poem, and you're reminded of like how like sumptuous language can be, or how much like longing or yearning can be like locked into a paragraph, or just sometimes the straightforward commands that writers give you about what the role of the writer is or what the role of the artist is, or like poems that from like revolutionaries to one another. Those are all windows in and ways into like reanimate the writing process for me when it feels dull. But it is often dull. I'll end there.
I love that. I mean, we're so different. I can never work in a library.
Oh, really?
If I go into a library, I will just sit there and nothing will happen. Like I'll go to get books or look up books, but I cannot do the mechanics of writing sentences.
In the library. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Do you have early writing memories? Do you know like when did you start writing thinking like, hey, I can do this? Or were you like a reader first? Like
I was a big reader when I was a kid, and I was an early writer as well. I think I remember when I was in school, I wrote a short story about a prison, ironically, from the perspective of the prison. Um, so I was like writing as if I were the prison walls, and there was like someone in there. I think I was experimenting at a young age, and I think obviously the prison element of it is really alerting us to the fact that I was alive to some form of containment that was organizing my life and others, which is where the kind of political vein through my writing comes out. But I did that, and then I also I still have this book that I made, which was like a book of, I did some collaging of like quotes from my favorite books. But this was when I was really young and I was reading like, yeah, I won't say what I was reading, but I was reading books that weren't very good. But I was like, I felt very deeply about these books, and I would cut out sentences and then I would write poems. So I have this collection of poems. The first one I wrote when I was 11, and if you can believe it, it's like dreams, imagine, all of it. So I've been writing about the same thing for like 2 decades. But it is actually really sweet because I identify then what my like lineage is in language, what my ideas are, what I've always been trying to use language to do, which is the expand the constituency I was located in, whether that's like a class system, a racial hierarchy, the gendered division of labor. I've always been trying to pull those apart and envisage myself and others in different modes of relation. And that's what I see when I look back and I read those like 13-year-old poems about dreams.
that's really exciting. But also thinking about the architecture and the technologies of prisons at that age, your brain was like,
Yeah.
we need to dismantle institutions.
I was like, prisons seem really bad. We should get rid of them. We should really get rid of them. But I do have to shout out, like, I had a really great English teacher and sociology teacher at my school. I went to Enfield County, which is a comprehensive all-girls school in Enfield. And my teachers were just, they really nurtured my reading and my writing habits, and made me think like politics and literature together always, and never made me feel like I was too much for what my like literary or political concerns were. They were just brilliant. And yeah, shout out to Mr. Ryan and Miss Foster.
Shout out to the teachers. We love teachers. Without my English and media teachers, like I don't know. Yeah, I'd be a different person. I know you do workshops and stuff, but I don't. Do you do like creative writing workshops? Do you run those?
Yeah, I do. I do creative writing workshops. Currently, I'm doing an online writing course for a group of writers who are working on a long-term project and feeling stuck. And so we're having kind of mini lectures on like style and experimentation and what those things mean. And we're writing together using writing prompts. But I do creative writing workshops for young people mainly, which is my favorite, because they all kind of come in and they say, I don't really get this. Like, why is this important? And then by the end, they're like, yeah, I can use poetry to express, the deepest parts of my self and being. And they're all gay and they're all very interested in revolution. And so it's nice. It's often a nice meeting of minds.
Are there any of those like exercises you'd like want to share here? Are there things you get them to do, either the kids or the the adults?
So often I have these like 5 words that I use, or like some words that I use that are like care, strike, bright, free world, words that like reappear in my own writing. And I get people to do a free writing exercise after we've done some close readings of text, after we've kind of thought about what style and experimentation are. I get them to do a free writing exercise where they use any or all of those words in the exercise. And I think it gives people a direction, especially when we're doing like political writing. It gives people a frame and direction for what I mean by our like shared and collective understanding of like what politics is. I also get people to close read each other's work. Often I read an excerpt from Jackie Wang's poem called The Coral Tree, which is a staple. People love that poem. And I read it against like the OAD Manifesto or June Jordan's work or Wendy Trevino's work. Or in the course we read this poem or listened to this poem by Anthony Joseph called The Ark, which I recently heard him perform at a conference at the British Library on like Black literature. So I've been trying to mix it up. We sometimes read Vanessa Onuemezi's Dark Neighborhood, stories from that. Yeah, so sorry, I'm just kind of like going off on a tangent, but in terms of the free writing, I try and keep it very loose and open. And the aim is to actually, more so than to achieve anything in the writing process, it's to get people to not be afraid of sharing and kind of failing publicly or not being very good publicly. Because it's like it's trying to get back to the kind of, not, I don't want to say primal, but there's something instinctual about what you want to write rather than the craft. And I always try and separate that instinct from craft.
That's exciting. Again, experiments can and do fail. Like, let's just lean
Yeah.
in, right? Okay, last question. I mean, you've given us thousands of book recommendations today, so that's already really exciting. But are there any others that you want to shout out, like new books, old books, things coming out?
So for this book that I'm trying to write, I've been thinking a lot and reading a lot of essays about like literary culture, literary values. And there's this essay in Some of Us Did Not Die, which is a essay collection by June Jordan, called Nobody Mean More to Me Than You and the Future Life of Willie Jordan, which is a really good essay that I hadn't read before, where June Jordan talks about the experience of getting a class of hers to define the grammatical rules of Black English and how that's related to basically the state-sanctioned murder of a Black boy. And they kind of, in the essay, she talks about how the class comes up with this decision to write an open letter to the police department in Black English, and like what that kind of means for the expression of their grief and pain, and how they know actually that that's no substitute for the kinds of political organizing or the impossibility of doing justice to this person who has been murdered. But I think it's a really beautiful essay and one that made me think a lot. And then I also read Beauty and Truth by Amiri Baraka, which is a poem where he's basically like, if you're a poet, get used to being poor and get used to your job is to try and identify like beauty and truth, and your life is going to be fucking difficult because any money, they don't have any prestige, nobody likes them. It's a really fun poem, but I think it really like returned me to like the ethical responsibility that writing held and holds for lots of people. And the last one I'll say, actually, I've got loads. I just finished reading Fantasia by Nisha Ramia, and I really loved that book. For there's a poem in that book called Three for Alice, which I thought was beautiful, and the way that she plays with like sound and language, the way that she makes words do things that I couldn't otherwise, that they wouldn't maybe otherwise do. I don't know. I felt like I was reading it, and it was one of those texts where I was like, if I don't pay attention, I'm going to be very lost in about 4 sentences because I'm not going to know what's going on. And that is a very like exciting proposition. Another book that I read not very recently, but one that stuck around as a contemporary novel that I think, yeah, is one of the best I've read is Maya Binion's Hangman. Is like a beautiful novel about somebody who is like, who was exiled and kind of like returns home, but it's the reason why it's beautiful is that there is this unreliable narrator, but it's not even that the narrator is unreliable, he's just absent from the facts of his own life. Like, there is a real exploration of what it means to be removed and distant, and what it means to like take apart that like immigrant story as it happens in both directions. So, you know, the imperial core is this place of the fruition of one's personal dream, and home as a site of belonging. And lastly, sorry, I'll say I also revisited in order to do some research from this book, Charting the Journey, which is a classic Black feminist UK text by a whole bunch of authors, including Gail Lewis. And in there's like essays about political organizing, but there's also a lot of poetry. And there is this conversation between Alice Walker and someone else, I can't remember. They're talking about Joan Riley's book, like one of the first books published by a Black woman in Britain. And they're kind of talking about the politics of that book and writing processes. And I think it really captures the energy of the literary culture in the 80s, this sense of there being like a Black feminist sensibility that was crossing borders, and people were beginning to use the novel form as like a site of political consciousness raising, or at least an expression of the violence of race and gender. And yeah, that really struck me as well. But Charting the Journey is a beautiful book, which I highly recommend. It's like Sheba Press, kind of hard to get one's hands on, but I'm sure you can find a copy online.
Amazing. I will link to all of these suggestions in the notes and stuff. You've given us so much to think about. Or if no one else, like, you've given me a lot to think about, Lola. So I really appreciate it, and appreciate your time today. It means a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.